On a cold, snowy morning, a 10-year-old boy named Ethan decides to help his elderly neighbor, Mr. Crawford, shovel snow. What starts as a small act of kindness blossoms into a touching bond between two unlikely friends. But little does Ethan know, someone is watching him from a distance, a man in a black business suit who holds a heartbreaking secret. When tragedy strikes, Ethan's life is forever changed in the most unexpected way. Who is the mysterious man, and what surprise awaits Ethan the next day? Stay tuned to find out. But before that, comment where you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The world had turned white overnight. Fat snowflakes drifted past Ethan Williams' bedroom window, adding to the thick blanket that already covered their suburban street. The 10-year-old pressed his nose against the cold glass, his warm breath creating expanding circles of fog that he absent-mindedly traced with his finger. The streetlights cast a golden glow across the untouched snow, making it sparkle like his mother's special occasion glitter eyeshadow. "Ethan, baby, come eat your breakfast before it gets cold." His mother Danielle's voice carried from their modest apartment's kitchen, mixing with the aroma of maple syrup and fresh coffee. "Coming, Mom," Ethan called back, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from the winter wonderland outside. Their street, usually busy with morning commuters, lay silent under nearly 2 feet of fresh snow. The weather alert on his mom's phone had been beeping all night, warning of the heaviest snowfall their area had seen in decades. In the kitchen, Danielle stood at the counter in her wrinkled scrubs, dark circles under her eyes betraying her exhaustion from another double shift at Metro General Hospital. Her thick black hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and despite her obvious fatigue, she managed a warm smile as she set a plate of golden brown pancakes in front of her son. "You look tired, Mom," Ethan observed, drowning his pancakes in syrup. "Maybe you should call in sick today," Danielle chuckled, ruffling his curly hair. "Nurses don't get snow days, sweetheart. Especially not single mom nurses with growing boys to feed." She sipped her coffee, watching as Ethan wolfed down his breakfast. "The plows haven't even come through yet. I'll have to leave extra early to make it on time." Ethan's eyes lit up. "I can help. I'll shovel the walkway and clear off your car." "Baby, that's sweet, but—" "Mom, I'm not a baby anymore," Ethan interrupted, puffing out his chest. "I'm 10 now. Double digits, remember?" Danielle's expression softened. "Of course you are, but that's a lot of snow out there, and I don't want you overexerting yourself." "I won't, I promise." Ethan was already pushing back from the table, carrying his empty plate to the sink. "Besides, I like helping people. Dad always said that's what makes a real man. Not how tall you are or how strong, but how willing you are to help others." The mention of his father made Danielle pause, her coffee cup halfway to her lips. 2 years had passed since the accident that took her husband, but sometimes grief still caught her off guard, sharp and sudden as a paper cut. Ethan had his father's heart, that same instinct to put others first, to see need and meet it without hesitation. "All right," she conceded, watching as Ethan practically bounced to the coat rack. "But bundle up properly. Hat, gloves, scarf, the whole works. And take breaks if you get tired." Ethan was already pulling on his winter boots, layering up with the enthusiasm only a child could muster for manual labor. His blue winter coat had grown a bit short in the sleeves, and Danielle made a mental note to check the thrift store for a replacement. The medical bills from James's final days still haunted their budget, but she was determined to keep Ethan's childhood as normal as possible. From their second-floor apartment window, Ethan could see the entire street clearly as he adjusted his gloves. Most houses were dark, their occupants likely taking advantage of the snow day to sleep in. All except one, the dilapidated Victorian across the street, where a single light burned in the kitchen window. That was Mr. Crawford's house. Everyone in the neighborhood knew about the old widower who lived there, though few had ever spoken to him. The once grand house had fallen into disrepair over the years, its paint peeling and gutters sagging. Some of the neighborhood kids claimed it was haunted, but Ethan had always felt sorry for the old man who lived there alone. As he watched, a hunched figure emerged onto the front porch, struggling with a snow shovel. Mr. Crawford, wrapped in what looked like an ancient wool coat, was attempting to clear his walkway. Even from across the street, Ethan could see the old man's hands shaking on the shovel handle. "Mom," Ethan called out, already heading for the door. "I'm going to help Mr. Crawford too." Ethan, wait. But he was already clattering down the stairs, their apartment's metal shovel in hand. The cold hit him like a wall as he pushed through the building's front door, but Ethan barely noticed. The snow was deep, coming halfway up his shins as he trudged across the street. Mr. Crawford had managed to clear maybe 2 feet of his walkway, but he was already breathing heavily, one hand pressed against his lower back. "Good morning, Mr. Crawford," Ethan called out cheerfully, waving as he approached. "Would you like some help?" The old man straightened up slowly, squinting at Ethan through wire-rimmed glasses. His face was deeply lined, like a map of all the years he'd lived, and his white hair stuck out wildly from beneath a weathered cap. "Help," he echoed, his voice gruff. "I don't need any charity, boy. I've been clearing this walk since before your parents were born." Ethan wasn't deterred by the prickly response. "It's not charity, sir. I just like helping. Besides, my mom always says that anything worth doing is worth doing together." Mr. Crawford's expression remained stern, but something flickered in his pale blue eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or a distant memory. "Your mother sounds like a wise woman," he said finally, his tone slightly softer. "But I couldn't possibly. Please." Ethan was already positioning his shovel. "I gotta practice anyway. Mom says I need to build up my muscles if I want to make the basketball team next year." A ghost of a smile tugged at Mr. Crawford's lips. "Well, I suppose if you're using me for practice, that's different than charity." He watched as Ethan began to clear a path, his movements enthusiastic, if not entirely efficient. "But mind you don't wear yourself out. Your technique needs work. Could you show me?" Ethan asked, genuinely interested. "The right way to do it?" Mr. Crawford hesitated, then stepped forward, adjusting his grip on his own shovel. "Well, you want to push more than lift. Save your back. Like this." He demonstrated, and soon they fell into a rhythm together, working side by side in the crisp morning air. Neither of them noticed the black luxury car parked halfway down the block, or its sole occupant watching their interaction with intense interest. The man in the expensive black suit sat perfectly still, his hands gripping the steering wheel though the engine wasn't running. His face, lined with age and regret, remained fixed on the unlikely pair clearing snow from the Victorian's walkway. As they worked, Ethan chatted easily, asking questions about the neighborhood and the house. Mr. Crawford's answers started out as short grunts, but gradually lengthened into real responses. Yes, he'd lived in the house for over 50 years. No, he didn't mind the creaky floors. They reminded him of his late wife, Margaret, who used to say the house was singing to them. Mrs. Crawford must have been very special, Ethan ventured, noting how the old man's voice softened when he mentioned her. Mr. Crawford paused, leaning on his shovel. She was. He looked up at the house, as if seeing it through different eyes. She loved this old place, kept a garden out back that was the envy of the neighborhood. Roses mainly, but all sorts of flowers. The whole yard would smell like heaven come spring. His voice trailed off, lost in memory. "Don't you have any family to help you with the house now?" Ethan asked innocently, immediately regretting the question when he saw Mr. Crawford's face cloud over. "Had a son once," the old man said shortly, attacking a snowdrift with renewed vigor. "Haven't seen him in, must be 20 years now. Made his fortune in real estate or banking or some such. Too busy for his old man, I suppose." The bitterness in his voice was sharp enough to cut. Ethan worked quietly for a moment, processing this. "I lost my dad 2 years ago," he offered finally. "Sometimes I think the missing gets bigger instead of smaller, you know?" Mr. Crawford's movement slowed, and he looked at Ethan with new understanding. "Yes," he said softly. "Yes, I suppose it does." They had cleared most of the driveway by now, working together in comfortable silence. Ethan's cheeks were red from cold and exertion, but his enthusiasm hadn't dimmed. When they reached the porch steps, he insisted on clearing those too, despite Mr. Crawford's protests that he'd done more than enough. "You're a good boy," Mr. Crawford said finally, watching as Ethan finished the last step. "Don't see many like you these days. Would you like to come in for some hot chocolate? I think I still remember how to work the stove." Ethan's face lit up at the invitation, but then fell slightly. "I should probably check on Mom's car first," he said reluctantly. "But maybe another time? I could come back tomorrow. The weather report says we might get more snow." "You come back," Mr. Crawford sounded genuinely surprised, as if the idea that anyone would willingly return to visit him was foreign. Of course. Ethan grinned. Besides, you still need to teach me more about proper snow shoveling technique. A real smile broke across Mr. Crawford's weathered face, transforming it completely. Well then, I'll hold you to that promise, young man. He extended his hand formally, and Ethan shook it, noting how carefully the old man held his smaller hand, as if it were something precious. As Ethan headed back across the street, the man in the black car watched him go, his expression a complex mixture of emotions. He reached for the door handle, as if to get out, then stopped himself. After a long moment, he started the engine and drove away slowly, the car's tires leaving fresh tracks in the pristine snow. Back in their apartment, Danielle was waiting by the window, her nurse's bag packed for a shift. She'd watched the entire interaction, her heart swelling with pride at her son's kindness. When Ethan burst through the door, cheeks red and eyes bright with accomplishment, she pulled him into a tight hug. "You're going to be late, Mom," he mumbled in her scrubs, but hugged her back just as tightly. "Some things are worth being late for," she whispered, kissing the top of his head. "Your father would be so proud of you, baby. So proud." Outside, the snow continued to fall, adding fresh layers to their newly cleared paths. But something had shifted in the quiet suburban street. A connection had been forged, a bridge built across years and loss and loneliness. And in a black car driving slowly away, a man who had watched it all unfold felt the first stirrings of hope he'd experienced in decades, though he didn't yet know why. The winter storm that had blanketed their neighborhood in white had done more than just transform the landscape. It had set in motion a chain of events that would change all their lives in ways none of them could possibly imagine. But for now, there was just a boy, a shovel, and the simple, profound power of choosing kindness over indifference. Dawn painted the snow-covered neighborhood in shades of pink and gold as Ethan carefully packed his backpack for the day ahead. He tucked a bright blue thermos filled with his mother's special chamomile tea between his math textbook and lunchbox, making sure the lid was tight. Danielle had stayed up late after her shift to brew it, adding just a touch of honey the way she always did when Ethan was sick. "Are you sure you don't want to rest today?" Danielle asked from the doorway, stifling a yawn. She was still in her pajamas, finally able to catch up on sleep during her rare day off. "The forecast says more snow is coming." Ethan zipped up his backpack and grabbed his shovel from beside the door. "That's exactly why I need to go, Mom. Mr. Crawford shouldn't be out there alone in this weather." He adjusted his wool hat, the one his father had given him on their last Christmas together. "Besides, I promised I'd come back." Danielle's eyes softened. "You're so much like your father, sometimes it takes my breath away." She crossed the room and wrapped him in a tight hug. "Just be careful, okay? And make sure Mr. Crawford drinks that tea while it's hot." The morning air was crisp and clean as Ethan made his way across the street, his boots crunching through a fresh dusting of snow that had fallen overnight. He could see smoke rising from Mr. Crawford's chimney, which meant the old man was already awake. Before Ethan could even knock, the door creaked open. Mr. Crawford stood there in a worn cardigan, his white hair slightly less disheveled than the day before. "Right on time," he said gruffly, but there was a warmth in his eyes that hadn't been there yesterday. "Though I told you yesterday, there was no need. I brought tea." Ethan interrupted cheerfully, pulling the thermos from his backpack. "Mom made it specially. She says it's good for keeping warm while working outside." Mr. Crawford accepted the thermos with slightly trembling hands. "Your mother didn't have to go to the trouble. She wanted to. She says everyone needs a little looking after sometimes." Ethan was already heading toward the porch steps with his shovel. "Even tough old guys like you, Mr. Crawford." A chuckle escaped the old man's lips, surprising them both. "Tough old guys, eh?" He watched as Ethan began clearing the fresh snow. "Well, I suppose I could use a supervisor out here. Let me get my coat." They worked together in comfortable silence for a while, sharing sips of the still warm tea between loads of snow. The sun climbed higher in the sky, making the untouched snow in the yard sparkle like diamond dust. "My Margaret would have loved this," Mr. Crawford said suddenly, gesturing at the winter landscape. "She always said snow made everything look fresh and new, like the world was starting over." He leaned on his shovel, lost in memory. "She kept the most beautiful garden right where that big drift is now. Roses mostly, but she had a way with all growing things. Ethan paused in his work, sensing this was a moment to listen rather than shovel. What kind of roses did she grow? Mr. Crawford's face lit up at the question. All kinds. Red ones that looked like velvet, yellow ones that smelled like honey, little pink climbing roses that would cover the back trellis. He pointed to each spot as he described it, and for a moment, Ethan could almost see the garden as it must have been. Wait here a moment. The old man disappeared into the house, returning a few minutes later with something cupped carefully in his hands. She gave me this on our 40th anniversary, he said, holding out an ornate silver pocket watch. Said a man should have something fine to mark the hours of his life with. Ethan wiped his snowy gloves on his coat before gently taking the watch. It was heavy in his hands, the silver case etched with delicate patterns of roses. When he pressed the catch, it opened to reveal not only the watch face, but a tiny photograph of a smiling woman with kind eyes and silver hair. "Is that Mrs. Crawford?" he asked softly. Mr. Crawford nodded, his eyes misty. "That's my Margaret. She could make anything grow, even happiness in a grumpy old man's heart." He took the watch back carefully, running his thumb over the picture before closing it. "Don't make them like this anymore. All digital nowadays." "Actually," Ethan said, excitement creeping into his voice, "there's still lots of people who make things by hand. My dad used to build model airplanes from scratch. He taught me all about how the different parts work together." His voice grew wistful. "That's why I want to be an engineer when I grow up. Dad said engineers get to solve problems and build things that help people." "An engineer?" Mr. Crawford considered this, tucking the watch back into his cardigan pocket. "That's a fine ambition. Though if you ask me, you're already building something greater than any machine." "What's that?" Ethan asked, puzzled. "Character, my boy. The strongest foundation a person can have." Mr. Crawford's voice was gruff but gentle. "Your father must have been quite a man to raise a son like you." Neither of them noticed the black luxury car parked down the street, or its occupant watching their interaction through tinted windows. Mr. Langston sat perfectly still, his expensive suit a sharp contrast to the casual interior of his vehicle. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he watched his father share the pocket watch with Ethan, a gesture he couldn't remember his father ever making with him. Back in the yard, Ethan had convinced Mr. Crawford to show him the backyard, where more snow needed clearing. As they worked their way through the drifts, Ethan spotted something hanging crookedly from a bare oak tree. "What's that?" he asked, pointing to the wooden structure swaying in the winter breeze. "Oh, that old thing." Mr. Crawford squinted up at it. "Used to be Margaret's bird feeder. She'd spend hours watching the cardinals and chickadees that would come to visit. Broken last summer's storm, and I never got around to fixing it." Ethan studied the feeder with interest. The roof had partially detached, and one of the perches was missing, but the basic structure seemed sound. "I could fix it," he offered. "Dad taught me how to use tools safely, and I'm pretty good at figuring out how things fit together." Mr. Crawford looked surprised. "You do that?" "Sure. It looks like it just needs some new screws and maybe a replacement perch. I could bring my dad's old toolbox tomorrow." Ethan's eyes were already mapping out the repairs needed. The birds probably miss having a place to get food in winter. The old man was quiet for a moment, looking between Ethan and the broken feeder. "Your father taught you well," he said finally, "both about tools and about seeing what needs fixing in the world." When they finished clearing the backyard, Mr. Crawford insisted on going inside to warm up. The house's interior was neat but showed signs of neglect. Dusty pictures on the walls, a slight mustiness in the air. But the kitchen was warm and bright, with 2 mugs of hot chocolate already steaming on the table. "Now then," Mr. Crawford said, reaching for his wallet, "I insist on paying you something for all this help." "Oh no, please don't," Ethan protested, holding up his hands. "You've already paid me with your stories. They're better than money anyway." Mr. Crawford slowly put his wallet away, studying Ethan with an expression that seemed to hold years of regret and newfound hope. "Stories, eh? Well, I suppose I do have quite a few of those left to tell." Meanwhile, across the street, Danielle was watching from their apartment window as she folded laundry. She'd seen her son spend hours clearing snow, talking, and now sharing hot chocolate with the old man who had always seemed so unapproachable before. When Ethan finally came home that afternoon, his cheeks were red from cold, but his eyes were bright with excitement. "Mom," You won't believe what Mr. Crawford showed me." He launched into a detailed description of the pocket watch, the garden that used to be, and his plans to fix the bird feeder. "It sounds like you two are becoming good friends," Danielle said, helping him out of his snow-crusted coat. "He's really nice once you get to know him," Ethan insisted. "Just lonely, I think. Like how we were right after Dad died. Remember?" Danielle's hands stilled on the coat hooks. "Yes, baby, I remember." She turned to look at her son, concern and pride warring in her expression. "Just promise me you're not wearing yourself out? All this shoveling." "I'm fine, Mom, really. Mr. Crawford makes sure I take breaks, and we talk more than we work anyway." Ethan's face grew serious. He needs someone to talk to, Mom. Someone who'll listen to his stories about Mrs. Crawford and the way things used to be. Danielle pulled him into a tight hug, marveling at how her son could be so young and so wise at the same time. "Well then, I guess we'll need to keep making that chamomile tea, won't we?" Later that evening, as the streetlights flickered on and the temperature began to drop, Ethan made one last trip to Mr. Crawford's house to check on him before bedtime. The old man seemed touched by the gesture, standing in his doorway to watch Ethan head back home through the gathering darkness. Neither of them noticed Mr. Langston finally step out of his car, taking a few hesitant steps toward the house before stopping abruptly. He watched as his father, a man he hadn't spoken to in 20 years, raise his hand in a warm farewell to a 10-year-old boy who had somehow managed to do what he never could: break through the walls of Robert Crawford's carefully guarded heart. The regret on Mr. Langston's face was painful to witness as he turned back to his car, shoulders hunched against more than just the cold. He had waited too long, let too many years pass in silence. And now he watched as a child showed him what courage really looked like: the simple bravery of offering friendship without judgment or condition. The snow began to fall again as darkness settled over the neighborhood. In his car, Mr. Langston sat with his hands gripping the steering wheel, watching the lights go out one by one in his father's house. In her apartment, Danielle smiled as she watched Ethan carefully pack his father's old toolbox for tomorrow's bird feeder repair mission. And in his bed, Mr. Crawford held the pocket watch close, its silver case catching the moonlight as he whispered a quiet "thank you" to whatever twist of fate had sent him a young friend when he needed one most. The bond forming between the unlikely pair was more than just a connection between two souls separated by age and experience. It was a bridge across time itself, linking past and present, loss and hope, the wisdom of age and the simple, profound kindness of a child's heart. And somewhere in the darkness, a man in a black suit finally started his car's engine, knowing that tomorrow would bring another chance to find the courage that seemed to come so naturally to a 10-year-old boy with a shovel and a thermos of tea. Morning arrived with an unsettling stillness. The snow had stopped falling sometime during the night, leaving the world wrapped in a pristine white blanket that muffled all sound. Ethan woke earlier than usual, his father's toolbox already packed and waiting by his bedroom door. He'd spent the evening before carefully organizing the tools he'd need to fix Mr. Crawford's bird feeder, even practicing some of the repairs on an old wooden box to make sure he could do it right. "Morning, Mom," he called out cheerfully, but the apartment was quiet. He found a note on the kitchen counter in his mother's neat handwriting: "Emergency shift at the hospital. Breakfast in the microwave. Love you, be careful, Ma." Ethan reheated the oatmeal she'd left him, adding extra brown sugar the way he liked it. Through the kitchen window, he could see Mr. Crawford's house across the street. Usually by now, there would be a warm light glowing in the kitchen window, but today the house looked dark and still. He probably slept in, Ethan said to himself, trying to ignore the strange feeling in his stomach. He rushed through his breakfast, pulled on his winter gear, and gathered his supplies. The toolbox was heavy, but he managed it carefully, remembering his father's lessons about tool safety. The morning air bit at his cheeks as he crossed the street. Fresh snow completely covered the pathway they'd cleared yesterday, unmarked by any footprints. The driveway, too, was untouched, which was odd. Mr. Crawford always got up early, a habit from his working days, he'd said. "Mr. Crawford?" Ethan called out, climbing the porch steps. No answer. He knocked on the door, the sound echoing oddly in the winter silence. "Mr. Crawford, it's Ethan. I brought my tools to fix the bird feeder." Still nothing. The uneasy feeling in his stomach grew stronger. He pressed his face against the front window, cupping his hands around his eyes to block the glare. The living room was dark, but he could make out the armchair where Mr. Crawford usually sat, empty. "Looking for old Mr. Crawford, dear?" Ethan turned to find Mrs. Chun from next door standing at the bottom of the porch steps, still in her bathrobe and winter boots. Her face wore an expression he'd seen before, the same look people had given him at his father's funeral. "There was an ambulance here very early this morning," she said gently. "Around 3 o'clock. I saw the lights from my window." Ethan's throat felt tight. "An ambulance? But he was fine yesterday. We had hot chocolate, and he showed me his pocket watch, and..." Mrs. Chin climbed the steps slowly, placing a soft hand on his shoulder. "The paramedics did everything they could, dear. But sometimes, when it's your time..." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Mr. Crawford passed away in his sleep. Very peaceful, they said. No pain at all." The toolbox slipped from Ethan's numb fingers, landing with a muffled thud in the snow. He barely noticed. His mind was racing through yesterday's conversations, searching for signs he might have missed. Had Mr. Crawford seemed more tired than usual? Had his hands shaken more when holding the tea? Should he have stayed longer? Checked on him one more time before bed? "I should have come back last night," he whispered, sinking down onto the porch steps. "I was going to, but Mom said it was too late, and I thought I'd see him in the morning." Mrs. Chun sat beside him, her bathrobe gathering snow. "Oh, sweetheart, you mustn't blame yourself. Mr. Crawford talked about you yesterday. You know, I saw him getting his mail, and he told me all about the kind young man who'd been helping him, who reminded him of his own son when he was young." Ethan's hand went to his coat pocket, where Mr. Crawford's pocket watch rested. The old man had pressed it into his hands just before he'd left yesterday, saying, "Here, you keep this safe for me. Seems right it should belong to someone who appreciates its story." Now the watch felt impossibly heavy in his pocket. He pulled it out, the silver case catching the pale morning light. The roses etched into its surface seemed to blur as tears filled his eyes. "Ethan," his mother's voice cut through the quiet morning. Danielle was running across the street, still in her scrubs, her hospital ID badge swinging from her neck. She must have come straight from her shift. "Baby, I just heard." She gathered him into her arms, and finally, Ethan let the tears fall. "He's gone, Mom," he sobbed in her shoulder. "Just like Dad. They're both gone." "I know, baby, I know." Danielle rocked him gently, her own eyes bright with tears. "But listen to me. You gave Mr. Crawford such a precious gift these past few days. Do you know what that was?" Ethan shook his head, still clutching the pocket watch. "You gave him friendship when he needed it most. You listened to his stories, showed him kindness, made him feel valued again." She pulled back slightly, wiping his tears with her thumb. "That's worth more than all the shoveled driveways in the world." "Your mother's right," a deep voice said from behind them. They turned to find a tall man in an expensive black suit standing at the bottom of the porch steps. His face bore traces of Mr. Crawford's features, but harder, more weathered by regret than age. Snow dusted his shoulders, suggesting he'd been standing there for some time. "I'm William Langston," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Robert Crawford was my father." Ethan stared at him, recognition dawning. "You're the man from the car, the one who's been watching." Mr. Langston nodded, looking ashamed. "I've been trying to work up the courage to speak to my father for days now. Watching you with him, seeing how easily you gave the love and attention I was too proud, too stubborn to give." He trailed off, swallowing hard. "I've been parked down the street every day, telling myself today would be the day I'd finally walk up those steps. But I waited too long. Why didn't you just come talk to him?" Ethan asked, genuine puzzlement in his voice. "He missed you. He told me about when you were little, how you used to help him in the garden." Mr. Langston's composed facade cracked slightly. "He talked about that. He talked about you a lot, actually. Said you made your fortune in real estate or banking. He wasn't sure which. He tried to sound angry when he talked about you, but mostly he just seemed sad." "Banking," Mr. Langston said softly. "I went into banking, built a career, made millions. Thought I was proving something to him." He laughed bitterly. "And here you are, a 10-year-old boy, showing me what real wealth looks like. The wealth of a kind heart freely given." Danielle had been watching this exchange silently, her arms still protective around Ethan. Would you like to come inside, Mr. Langston? I'm sure there are arrangements that need to be made. But Mr. Langston was already backing away, his carefully maintained control visibly slipping. I need to. There are calls I should make. Arrangements, yes. He pulled a business card from his pocket, holding it out with a slightly trembling hand. Please, if you need anything at all. He turned abruptly and walked to his car, his polished shoes leaving sharp prints in the snow. Just before getting in, he paused, looking back at Ethan. Thank you, he said, his voice barely carrying across the quiet street. For giving my father what I couldn't, for showing me what I should have done. Then he was gone, the black car pulling away smoothly into the winter morning. Ethan watched the car disappear, then looked down at the pocket watch in his hands. The silver case had warmed to his touch, as if it held some remnant of Mr. Crawford's warmth within it. Carefully, he opened it, looking at the photograph of Mrs. Crawford's smiling face. Mom, he said suddenly, can you help me with something? Of course, baby. Anything. I want to fix the bird feeder. The one in the backyard. Mr. Crawford said Mrs. Crawford used to love watching the birds, and he picked up the fallen toolbox, brushing off the snow. I know it won't bring him back, but maybe the birds will still come. Maybe they'll remember this was their home too. Danielle's eyes filled with fresh tears, but she smiled. I think that's a beautiful idea. Your father would be so proud of you right now. Both of your fathers would be. They spent the morning in Mr. Crawford's backyard, Ethan carefully repairing the old bird feeder while Danielle held pieces steady and handed him tools. The work was therapeutic, giving his hands something to do while his heart processed its loss. He remembered everything his father had taught him about working with wood, about measuring twice and cutting once, about taking pride in even the smallest repairs. As he worked, he told his mother stories about his conversations with Mr. Crawford, about the garden that used to bloom here, about Mrs. Crawford's love of roses, about the life that had filled this space before loneliness had crept in. With each story, the weight in his chest seemed to lighten a little. Finally, the bird feeder was repaired, its roof firmly reattached, new perches carefully installed where the old ones had broken away. Together, they filled it with seed from a bag they found in Mr. Crawford's garage, then stood back to admire their work. Look, Danielle whispered, pointing. A bright red cardinal had landed on one of the new perches, its feathers brilliant against the snow. It tilted its head, studying them, before beginning to eat. Soon it was joined by another, then another, until the feeder was surrounded by birds, their cheerful movement bringing life back to the silent yard. Ethan reached into his pocket, feeling the smooth silver case of the pocket watch. He imagined Mr. Crawford watching from somewhere with Mrs. Crawford by his side, both of them smiling at the birds returning to their garden. The thought brought fresh tears, but these weren't quite as painful as before. You know what, Mom? He said, watching the birds feast. I think sometimes love is like this bird feeder. Even when it's broken, it can be fixed. Even when people are gone, the love they shared can still feed something beautiful. Danielle hugged him close, understanding that her son was growing in ways that had nothing to do with height or age. That's very wise, baby, and very true. They stood there together in the snowy yard, watching the birds celebrate their restored sanctuary, while somewhere across town, a man in an expensive suit sat in his parked car, looking at old photographs and learning, too late, that the greatest fortune a person can build is not in a bank, but in the hearts of those who love them. The pocket watch in Ethan's pocket kept ticking, marking time not just in hours and minutes, but in moments of love given and received, in kindnesses shared, in bridges built across the chasms of age and loss and regret. And though the house behind them stood empty now, it felt more alive than it had in years, filled with the echo of stories shared, of friendship freely given, of love that, like the returning birds, knew exactly where to find its home. A week had passed since Mr. Crawford's funeral. The snow was beginning to melt, creating silvery rivulets down the streets and exposing patches of dormant grass beneath. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, pushing his cereal around listlessly while Danielle prepared for another hospital shift. The birds are still coming to the feeder, he said quietly, watching through the window as a group of chickadees fluttered around his repair work. I've been refilling it every morning. Danielle paused in packing her lunch, recognizing the sadness in her son's voice. That's good, baby. You're keeping your promise, too. The screech of tires outside interrupted her. A sleek black limousine had pulled up in front of their apartment building, its polished surface reflecting the morning sun. Danielle moved to the window, instinctively stepping in front of Ethan as a uniformed driver emerged and opened the rear door. William Langston stepped out, looking somehow both more composed and more approachable than he had at their last meeting. His expensive suit was impeccable as ever, but his face had lost some of its haunted quality. He carried a thick manila envelope in one hand. "Mom?" Ethan had joined her at the window. "That's Mr. Crawford's son." The building's ancient buzzer sounded, making them both jump. Danielle hesitated before pressing the intercom button. "Yes, Mrs. Williams? This is William Langston. I apologize for coming unannounced, but I have something important to discuss with you and Ethan. May I come up?" Danielle looked at her watch, then at her work uniform. "I have a shift starting in. I've already called the hospital." Mr. Langston's voice crackled through the speaker. "They're aware you'll be late today. Please, this is important." Minutes later, Mr. Langston sat at their small kitchen table, looking slightly out of place among the cheerful but worn furnishings. He declined coffee, but sat with perfect posture, the envelope placed carefully before him. "First," he began, "I want to apologize for my abrupt departure last week. I wasn't prepared for the depth of emotion seeing you both would trigger." He cleared his throat. "But I'm here now because my father left very specific instructions about what was to happen after his passing." "Instructions?" Danielle asked, her hand finding Ethan's under the table. Mr. Langston nodded. "Would you both be willing to come with me to the house? There's something you need to see." The short drive across the street in the limousine felt surreal. Ethan pressed his face against the tinted window, watching as they pulled up to Mr. Crawford's Victorian home. It looked different somehow, less abandoned, as if knowing its future was about to change had awakened something in its old bones. Inside, the house smelled of furniture polish and coffee. A team of cleaners had been through, Ethan realized, noting how the dusty surfaces now gleamed and the musty air had been replaced with the scent of lemon and pine. Mr. Langston led them to the study, a room Ethan hadn't seen before. Dark wood bookshelves lined the walls, and a massive desk dominated the space. On it sat a single document folder. "My father amended his will 3 days before he passed away," Mr. Langston said, opening the folder. "The day after you fixed the bird feeder, Ethan," he pulled out a document, his voice taking on a formal tone. "To quote directly, to Ethan Williams, who showed me that the greatest wealth lies not in what we possess, but in what we give, I leave my home at 1847 Maple Street, along with a trust fund of $500,000 for his education and future endeavors." The silence that followed was absolute. Danielle's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. Ethan stood perfectly still, certain he had misheard. "To the house," he whispered. "But I can't. There's more," Mr. Langston continued, his voice gentler now. "To Danielle Williams, whose son's kindness speaks volumes about her own character, I leave an additional sum of $200,000 to ease the burden of single parenthood and ensure Ethan's dreams can be pursued without financial constraint." Danielle sank into a leather armchair, overwhelmed. "This is too much. We can't possibly." "You can, and you will," Mr. Langston interrupted firmly. "Because my father was right. What Ethan gave him in his final days was worth more than any property or sum of money." His composed facade cracked slightly. "I should know. I chose wealth over relationship, success over family. I told myself I was too busy building my future to spare time for my past. And now," he walked to the window, looking out at the overgrown garden. "I watched you, Ethan. Every day, I sat in my car and watched you do what I should have done. Reach out, show kindness, listen to his stories. You gave him back his dignity, his joy. You made him feel valued again. But it wasn't hard," Ethan protested. "I just liked talking to him, hearing about Mrs. Crawford in the garden, and..." His voice caught. "I miss him." Mr. Langston turned back, his eyes bright. "That's exactly why you deserve this. Because for you, kindness isn't a transaction or an obligation. It's who you are." He stepped forward, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "My father saw that. He saw in you the grandson he should have had if I'd been a better son." Ethan looked around the study, taking in the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, the comfortable leather chairs, the large windows overlooking what had once been Mrs. Crawford's prize garden. But what would we do with such a big house? Live in it, Mr. Langston said simply. Fill it with life again, maybe even restore the garden. He smiled slightly. Speaking of which, there's something else you should see. He led them to a door off the kitchen that Ethan hadn't noticed before. It opened to reveal a small mudroom, its walls lined with gardening tools, pruning shears, trowels, ancient terracotta pots, and implements Ethan couldn't even name. These were my mother's, Mr. Langston explained, running a finger along a well-worn spade handle. Father kept everything exactly as she left it. Couldn't bear to change anything after she passed. He turned to Ethan. They should be used again, don't you think? The garden was always meant to be more than just a memory. Ethan picked up one of the trowels, its wooden handle smooth from years of use. He could almost imagine Mrs. Crawford's hands holding it, working the soil, nurturing beauty from the earth. I don't know much about gardening, he admitted, but I could learn for them. You won't have to learn alone, a voice called from the kitchen doorway. Mrs. Chun stood there, still in her winter coat. Sorry for intruding, but I saw the limousine and, well, neighborhood curiosity got the better of me. She stepped into the mudroom, her eyes lighting up at the sight of the tools. I remember Margaret's garden. It was the pride of the neighborhood. I'd be honored to teach you what I know, Ethan. My own garden could use a young pair of helping hands. And I can help with the heavy lifting, called another voice. Mr. Rodriguez, who lived 2 doors down, appeared behind Mrs. Chun. These old houses need constant care. My father was a carpenter, taught me everything he knew. More neighbors began to appear, drawn by the unusual sight of the limousine and the open door of the house that had been closed for so long. Each one had a story about Mr. and Mrs. Crawford, a memory of the garden in its glory days, an offer of help or expertise. Danielle watched in amazement as the kitchen filled with people, all talking excitedly about repairs and renovations, about garden plans and paint colors. She felt a gentle touch on her arm and turned to find Mr. Langston watching the scene with equal wonder. You see, he said softly, this is what my father saw in Ethan, the ability to bring people together, to inspire the best in them. One act of kindness rippling outward, touching lives, rebuilding connections. Ethan stood in the center of it all, still holding Mrs. Crawford's trowel, his eyes wide with possibility. Suddenly, he remembered something. Wait here, he told the gathered neighbors, running up the curved staircase to the second floor. In Mr. Crawford's bedroom, everything was exactly as it had been. The bed was neatly made, the curtains drawn back to let in the morning light. Ethan went to the bedside table where he'd last seen Mr. Crawford place the pocket watch. Carefully, he picked it up, feeling its familiar weight in his hands. Back downstairs, the neighbors parted to let him through as he walked to the living room fireplace. With deliberate movements, he placed the watch on the mantel, positioning it so the morning sun caught the etched roses on its case. This house will always remind me of him, he said quietly, but in the hushed room, everyone heard. Of both of them. And now it can be a place where new memories grow, like Mrs. Crawford's roses. Mr. Langston stepped forward, placing a hand on the mantel beside the watch. My father would have loved that. He turned to address the room. And I intend to honor his wishes not just in letter, but in spirit. I'll be establishing a community fund in my parents' names to help restore other historic homes in the neighborhood. The Crawford legacy should be about more than just one house, one garden. The neighbors burst into excited discussion, but Ethan hardly heard them. He was looking at the pocket watch on the mantel, imagining Mr. Crawford sitting in his favorite chair, sharing stories of the past while outside, through the window. He could see the first tiny buds of spring pushing through the melting snow where Mrs. Crawford's roses would bloom again. Danielle came to stand beside him, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. What are you thinking, baby? Ethan leaned into her embrace, his voice thoughtful. I'm thinking about what Mr. Crawford said about building character being more important than building things. But maybe sometimes, when you build something with love, like fixing a bird feeder or planting a garden, you're really building both. Through the window, they could see the birds still coming to the feeder, their movements bringing life to the winter bare branches. Soon, those branches would burst with leaves and blossoms, and the garden would awaken from its long sleep. But more than that, the house itself was awakening, filling with voices and laughter, with plans and possibilities, with the promise of new stories waiting to be written. Mr. Langston watched from the study doorway as Ethan began showing Mrs. Chun the gardening tools, his young face alight with enthusiasm as she explained their uses. In that moment, he understood completely why his father had made the choice he did. Some inheritances weren't about money or property at all, but about recognizing and rewarding the kind of wealth that couldn't be measured, the wealth of a generous heart, freely given. The morning sun streamed through the windows, catching the silver pocket watch on the mantel and making it gleam like a beacon. Its steady ticking seemed to echo the heartbeat of the house itself, marking not just the passage of time, but the beginning of a new chapter in its long history. A chapter that would be written by a boy who understood that the greatest gifts aren't the ones we receive, but the ones we give away. Outside, the last of the winter snow continued to melt, revealing the first green shoots of spring pushing through the soil of what had once been, and would soon be again, the most beautiful garden on Maple Street. Spring arrived in a burst of color and warmth, transforming the neighborhood from its winter slumber. The Crawford house, as everyone still called it, had undergone its own transformation. Fresh paint and warm cream with forest green trim restored its Victorian charm, while inside, the rooms had slowly filled with the comfortable chaos of family life. Ethan's model airplanes, carefully crafted with his father's old tools, now hung from the ceiling of what had once been Mr. Crawford's study. Danielle's collection of nursing textbooks and medical journals found a home on the built-in shelves, sharing space with vintage gardening guides and worn photo albums. Even the kitchen, with its updated appliances, maintained touches of its past. Mrs. Crawford's handwritten recipe cards framed on the wall, Mr. Crawford's favorite coffee mug still hanging on its designated hook. "Mom," Ethan called from the front hall one morning, struggling with an armload of flyers. The printer dropped these off for the community snow shoveling program. Danielle emerged from the kitchen, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron. She'd taken to baking on her days off, filling the house with scents that seemed to chase away the last lingering shadows of loneliness from its corners. "Let me see those, baby." The flyers were simple but eye-catching. Crawford Community Helpers, because nobody should face winter alone. Below was an image of a snow shovel crossed with a garden rake, and details about the program Ethan had started. "Mr. Rodriguez helped me design them," Ethan explained proudly. "We're going to pair up older residents with student volunteers. Everyone who signs up gets a bright yellow scarf, just like the one Mr. Crawford used to wear when he worked in his garden." The program had started small, just Ethan and a few of his school friends helping elderly neighbors with snow removal. But like all acts of kindness, it had grown beyond its original scope. Now, dozens of students had signed up to help, and the project had expanded to include yard work, basic home repairs, and regular visits to seniors living alone. William called earlier, Danielle mentioned, using Mr. Langston's first name now that he'd become such a regular presence in their lives. "He wants to know if you're free for lunch tomorrow. Something about an engineering program at the university." Ethan's eyes lit up. Ever since learning about his interest in engineering, Mr. Langston had taken on the role of mentor with unexpected enthusiasm. He'd introduced Ethan to professional engineers, arranged tours of manufacturing facilities, and even helped him set up a small workshop in the garage where Mr. Crawford had once parked his old Buick. He said there's a special summer program for middle school students interested in robotics, Ethan explained, carefully arranging the flyers into neat piles. "But that's not until next week. Tomorrow is important for a different reason." Danielle paused in her sorting. "Oh, it's Mr. Crawford's birthday." Ethan's voice grew softer. "I've been planning something special. Want to see?" He led his mother through the kitchen and out the back door, where Mrs. Crawford's garden had begun to show signs of revival. Under Mrs. Chen's patient guidance, Ethan had learned to coax life from the long-dormant soil. The rose bushes were still small, but their leaves were a healthy green, promising blooms to come. Near the repaired bird feeder, which had become a neighborhood landmark of sorts, a young oak sapling stood ready for planting, its root ball wrapped carefully in burlap. "Mr. Langston helped me choose it," Ethan explained, touching one of the small branches gently. "It's a white oak. They can live for hundreds of years." "I thought I thought Mr. Crawford would like knowing something that strong and lasting would grow here. Danielle wrapped her arm around her son's shoulders, marveling at how much taller he seemed than just a few months ago. I think he'd love it, baby. Do you want help planting it? By afternoon, a small crowd had gathered in the backyard. Mr. Langston arrived in his usual suit, but had rolled up his sleeves to help dig. Mrs. Chun brought traditional Chinese tea to share, explaining that in her culture, trees were symbols of connection between heaven and earth. Mr. Rodriguez and his wife came with homemade tamales, and other neighbors dropped by with tools, advice, and stories about the Crawfords. As Ethan carefully positioned the sapling in its new home, the bird feeder above was alive with activity. Cardinals, chickadees, and finches fluttered back and forth, seemingly unperturbed by the human gathering below. A pair of mourning doves had even built a nest in the nearby lilac bush, as if giving their approval to the changes in their territory. "Look at all of them," Mrs. Chun remarked, watching the birds. "Margaret would have loved this. She always said birds bring messages from heaven. And good luck," Mr. Rodriguez added. "In Mexico, we say birds carry the songs of angels." Ethan patted the soil around the sapling's base, remembering Mr. Crawford's words about building character being more important than building things. Somehow, he'd ended up doing both, building a community while building a garden, growing friendship while growing flowers. Later that evening, after the neighbors had gone home and Mr. Langston had left for a business dinner, but not before scheduling their next engineering mentoring session, Ethan sat at the desk in his room. The pocket watch rested beside him as he opened a leather-bound journal, a gift from Mr. Langston on the day they'd moved in. "Dear Mr. Crawford," he wrote, his young face serious with concentration. "I wish you could see how everything has changed, but also how much has stayed the same. Your house is still full of stories, but now there are new stories mixing with the old ones. Mom bakes cookies in Mrs. Crawford's kitchen. Mr. Langston comes for dinner sometimes, and he tells me about when he was my age, playing in the garden while Mrs. Crawford tended her roses. The bird feeder you loved is always busy now. Mrs. Chun says each bird brings a different blessing. I like to think they're carrying messages between heaven and earth, like she said, keeping us connected to you and Mrs. Crawford and Dad. I promise to keep taking care of things here. Not just the house and the garden, but the important things you taught me about kindness and character. Mom says I'm growing up fast, but I think maybe I'm just growing the way you showed me, like your oak trees with strong roots and branches reaching up to help others. Mr. Langston is teaching me about engineering, but I'm also learning about the kind of building you talked about, building bridges between people, building community, building hope. I want you to know that every time I help someone, every time I share what you taught me about kindness, it's like planting another seed in the garden of your memory. I miss you, but I'm not sad anymore when I think about you. Instead, I feel grateful that even though our time together was short, you showed me how much difference one person's kindness can make. I promise to keep that lesson alive, to pass it on to others, to make sure your legacy grows as tall and strong as the oak tree we planted today. Thank you for everything, Mr. Crawford. Your friendship changed my life, and through me, it's changing others too. That's a different kind of forever, isn't it? With love and gratitude, Ethan. He closed the journal carefully, wiping a stray tear from his cheek. Outside his window, the spring evening was fading into dusk, and the first stars were appearing in the lavender sky. The bird feeder stood in silhouette against the sunset, a few late visitors still coming for their evening meal. Downstairs, he could hear his mother talking on the phone with the hospital, arranging her shifts around his upcoming robotics program. Her voice carried traces of laughter, something he'd been hearing more often lately, as if the house itself was helping heal old wounds. The doorbell rang, and Ethan hurried to answer it, knowing it would be Mr. Langston returning for their evening ritual. Ever since the day of the oak tree planting, he'd made a point of stopping by at dusk, no matter how busy his day had been. Sure enough, the banker stood on the porch in his immaculate suit, his driver waiting in the idling limousine. But tonight, something was different. As Ethan opened the door, the first snowflakes of an unseasonable spring snow began to fall. "Perfect timing," Mr. Langston said, smiling at the weather. "I thought we might take a walk before it gets too heavy. I have something to show you." They walked in comfortable silence down the street, the soft snow creating a familiar hush around them. Mr. Langston led them to the neighborhood park where, to Ethan's surprise, a small group of people had gathered despite the weather. "What's going on?" Ethan asked, recognizing faces from his community helpers program. "These," Mr. Langston gestured to a row of brand new snow shovels leaning against a park bench, each tied with a yellow scarf, "are for your volunteers. And this," he pulled an envelope from his coat, "is the official registration for the Crawford Community Foundation, a permanent organization to support your work, with you as its youngest board member." Ethan stared at the envelope, then at the shovels, then at the falling snow that seemed to be wrapping them all in a gentle embrace. "But I'm just a kid," he whispered. "You're the kid who taught a lonely old man how to love life again," Mr. Langston corrected gently. "The kid who showed a successful businessman what real wealth looks like. The kid who reminded an entire neighborhood how to be a community." They walked back to the house together, leaving the shovels to be distributed tomorrow when the snow would surely need clearing. The limousine followed at a discreet distance, its headlights casting long shadows that danced with the falling snowflakes. On the porch, Ethan paused, looking out at the transformed landscape. The oak sapling stood straight and proud in the gathering snow, its young branches already reaching for the sky. The bird feeder swayed gently in the evening breeze, ready to welcome tomorrow's visitors. And somewhere, he felt sure, Mr. Crawford was watching with approval as his legacy of kindness continued to grow and spread, like rings in a pond, touching life after life with its gentle wisdom. As Mr. Langston's limousine pulled away into the snowy evening, Ethan remained on the porch, watching until its taillights disappeared around the corner. The snow fell steadily now, adding its own layer of magic to the spring flowers pushing through the soil below. In this moment between seasons, between past and future, between childhood and something newer and deeper, Ethan felt the full weight of the gift he'd been given, not just the house or the trust fund, but the profound understanding that true wealth lies in what we give away, and true legacy lives in the kindness we share with others. Above him, a cardinal called out its evening song, a flash of red against the white sky. And in that moment, Ethan knew with absolute certainty that he would spend the rest of his life nurturing the seeds of kindness Mr. Crawford had planted in his heart, watching them grow into a garden more beautiful than any that had come before. For in the end, the greatest houses are built not of wood and stone, but of love and memory, of kindness given and received, of stories that continue long after their first telling. And in such houses, winter never truly comes, for they are kept warm by the endless spring of human kindness, blooming again and again in each new generation that learns to open its heart to others. Ethan's selfless act of kindness not only touched a lonely man's heart, but also transformed his own life in ways he never imagined. From loss to renewal, his story reminds us all of the power of compassion. And as he carries on Mr. Crawford's legacy, Ethan shows that even the smallest acts of kindness can leave an everlasting impact. What would you have done in Ethan's place? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more heartwarming stories.